Yeah, just to see if anybody would like to, I hope you had a interesting conversation, just see if anybody would like to share any thoughts or ideas, reflections from it.
Can I go? Is that okay?
Yeah, you go.
Yeah, I just put it in with an there. I was just saying I was speaking to Jess and Rosie, I think, who are also in the room. Although I think Rosie had to nip away to speak to her boss. But we were just saying it was kind of one of those questions where you can't really get to the bottom of it because it's so theoretical and it's so like. But we spoke about lots. We spoke about, I think Jess is part of the civil service, and she is. And I guess similar to me, where I work for a group that's part of many different organizations, there's so many different parts of it that there isn't really one particular identity. There's like the army or the, HMRC or the everything. And although there's like a view of it, it's quite hard to just pinpoint that one thing, and whether it's in like the leadership or the people who've been there for ages in the history, or like, the people who are pushing for change, all of that. It's very tricky because it's such a, I suppose, a theoretical question, but definitely a very interesting one. And I suppose, where do you kind of get how do you actually, I suppose this is a question really, but how do you improve the culture? Is it just a natural passing of time? Is that what makes culture, or is it something that organizations actually have the power to change, I guess? Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. You obviously found some depth in the question. I'm not sure I put it there, so I think you must have created it or discovered it. It's, some of those problems you can solve just by adding S to the end of it. So to recognize there is no such thing as culture per se. There are lots of cultures. Some of them are almost as small as you and me. And they're unreconciled. They don't come back together. But what potentially happens is the further you get away from the local, the greater the potential for delamination, where behavior peels away from mindset. So I think it is very possible to end up in organizations with a subscription culture where you turn up and you say the right things and do the right things, but you have no sense of actually belonging or believing in what is done. It's interesting that you describe it as theoretical, because I could agree with you. I could say, yeah, it's very theoretical, we're just passing our time over lunch. But I could also argue it the other way and say there's nothing more real. Organizations are meant to be effective on the whole. The two you mentioned, HMRC and the Army, both of them pretty much have a remit to be effective. They wouldn't normally describe themselves as cerebral entities that just think about things.
I do agree with that as well. I think it is very fascinating, but I think the issue is it's an impossible or very hard thing to solve. But I do agree, very important for sure.
It is difficult.
But hopefully you have the answer for us. So I'm kidding, anything.
Martin, did you have your hand up? Did you want to say something? Or anybody else?
Thanks. I was just, reflecting on the conversation that we had in our little breakout room. It struck me that we ended up talking in this creating a sense of duality almost between the policies, the procedure, what should be done and how things should be done, and actually what happens in reality. And then it struck me, well, that's pretty much what you were saying before about the whole formal structure and the social structure. And I think what's interesting is that the formal structures, they can be quite similar in a lot of businesses. You do this, you do that, you do that. Whereas the social structures will vary massively depending on the individuals involved in that community. And you just swap one person out and it will become very different. So yeah, that was reflections on our conversation. I've got nothing more to say really.
Yeah, no, I like it. I think that many of our most effective organizations are highly effective almost despite everything they do to try to be effective. They're effective because they're full of good people like you and me that turn up and care enough to do a pretty decent job most of the time, and they solve problems locally, but they often do so by divergent means. I'm doing some research at the moment actually in one of your organizations, but I'm not going to tell you which one, looking at learning and how people learn. And it was really interesting last week. I asked people to illustrate their landscape of learning, and it was just a dozen people. And they all came on and they all shared these crazy sort of spider webs of stuff. And every single person that shared their work said 2 words. They all apologized. I'm so sorry for sharing this thing that you asked me to do. And they said, it's all chaotic. And it led us into this conversation about how it's interesting when organizations talk about capability and learning, they do so in sort of these horizontal and vertical matrices in very tidy language and very clear engineering terms. You know, they sort of give the impression somehow that it is mappable and quantifiable. And yet the reality is very divergent. It's really quite chaotic. And again, that was a reminder to me that, you know, just because something is clear and tidy and seemingly simple doesn't make it true. I mean, it can still be useful. That's what models should be, you know, abstractions. They should be useful abstractions. But sometimes they fall into the trap of just being abstractions, and they start to lack validity, which sort of ties into, I think, Ellie, what you were saying. You know, we sort of end up building organizations that often look largely the same. That formal structure can actually end up being really very similar across many of our organizations, even though culture is different and the experience of it is different and their capability and ability is different. But I did work back in 2019, I think, for that book on the New York dereliction walk. It looks at how organizations fail. And it turns out that organizations that fail are full of people just as bright and good looking as you and me. You know, they're not full of idiots on the whole. They're full of good people doing good things, but they fail to collapse around a new narrative or a new truth, but not because they're ignorant of it. You know, they often didn't fail because they were ignorant of what needed to be done. They failed because they were unable to do what needed to be done. And that's interesting, you know, in organizations that use all sorts of mechanisms to get people to do things. There's clearly a gap between what was being done and what needed to be done. And it sort of leads you to the question, so how do we evolve what that dominant narrative is? How do we change the organization to operate in different ways, to hold capability differently?
Of which, in terms of interconnection, Julian, and your work on social leadership, have you seen that people are interconnecting within the organization in different ways, particularly post-pandemic, to ask the obvious question?
Well, you know, that is interesting. I mean, people are interconnecting for sure, but the extent to which they're doing it within the organization or beyond the organization is rather a more open question. So we, you know, within organizations, we see in general this kind of shift away from rigid structure, the organization as defined very clearly and tidily on a piece of paper, essentially, towards an organization of spaces. So it's kind of structure plus, you could view it. So organizations in general, and this is a big generalization, but I'll use it anyway. In general, they're saying we need to do not only what we used to do, we also need to discover the new things we have to do. We need somehow to conjure up our future potential. It won't just be handed to us on a plate. And in general, the way that they believe they will do that is by everybody they already employ connecting in or giving them something they don't already have. So there's this great push towards greater social collaboration, more individual agency at scale. At the same time, we see this more chaotic space. We see that learning has become much more of an ecosystem with many different types of knowledge, unsurprisingly, many of which are imperfect, although we shouldn't imagine the old forms of knowledge were that perfect either. We see organizations existing which don't codify any learning at all. You know, historically, our organizational learning functions used to be their job pretty much, you know, just capture knowledge and put it in a book or an e-learning program and hammer it into people. And now we move to the opposite, where learning, as people describe it, is predominantly done within communities and between themselves, looped rapidly into practice, rapidly iterative. So we see a lot of shift, and fundamentally a shift to this notion, sense making, figuring out just what is happening, you know, individually and collectively. And the tension between those two is really important, because the collective understanding isn't just the addition of our individual understanding. There's a tension between those, and that's right. So there should be. You know, we're all unique individuals and we experience the world through those lenses of experience and preconception and bias that we all have within us. But to understand then that we make sense of the world and we then act within the sense that we have made is important, because it would actually take us back to this question of what is culture and how do we change culture? Well, you know, culture is what I believe it to be and what we believe it to be. And hence we change culture by changing what we believe it to be. That would lead us into thinking about stories and power and the way stories are held organizationally, collectively, individually, and how those narratives can evolve. Catherine.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on, and particularly it's around this sense-making bit, as we introduce more and more bots, artificial intelligence, all of that artificial world into our everyday lives, and in particular into our working lives, it is going to make sense-making more challenging. What is real, what is not real, and therefore what impact might that have in the way that we frame our sense of being in those organizations, and how those organizations evolve, because there's, you know, as you say, the structural bit and the social bit and how that comes together, but then you've got a whole other layer of artificiality, and what influence is that going to have?
You know, it's very interesting. I'm working on two major books at the moment. One is about learning science, about these underlying processes of metacognition and sense making, and the other is about generative AI. And, you know, there's lessons between the two of them. So at its best, what generative AI does is it makes dialogue a solitary activity. So that's an incredible thing. You know, you can have a conversation with yourself with you know, facilitated by technology, which will give you these different perspectives. And, you know, at worst, it will lead us into a sort of monocultural desert. At best, it will let us challenge our preconceptions, which form part of that framing. So, you know, we sometimes think that the world is binary, but it isn't. You know, there's what we believe, there's what we don't yet know, but then there's this space in the middle where we're just trying to figure out what on earth is going on, and we're often blinded in that space by the things we have already learned. So some things are so true that we forget that they're ever invented, like money. You know, money is so true that we come to believe that it's real, but of course it isn't. You could absolutely run a society without money. You just have to think about how you did it differently. So we sort of constrain ourselves, you know, our own brilliance constrains us from seeing the alternatives. So maybe these technologies will let us fracture our certainty more easily. And that disturbance is a fundamental precondition for learning. Or maybe not. Maybe we'll use them badly or design them badly, and then they won't, and then we'll be in trouble. If you see some of the most difficult conversations playing out today, conversations about trans rights and recognition, are a very live and dynamic example of the rapid prototyping of alternative structures of understanding. And, you know, of course, it's easy and it's right sometimes to stand up and deny other viewpoints, but if you look at it in a more abstract sense, if you can move beyond a core belief that there are some bad people saying bad things, what we see is that there are lots of people saying things that are very, very true from where they stand. Because when you change a dominant narrative, what you do is you take away some of that certainty. You are kicking the foundations out from underneath people. You're taking something away from them. And a thing we learn very early is that loss is felt much more acutely than gain. There's all sorts of research that shows it very clearly. To have something taken away from you, even if it's only a belief or a truth, is far more painful than the benefit you would get from winning the lottery. You know, it's visceral inside us. So I better sort of start to wrap us towards the end, and I forget who said that one of their friends had a good experience the other week talking to me. I'm not quite sure how it went today. We're a bit all over the place, but you know, I enjoyed the chance to talk to you. I'll just share, this is all the stuff we didn't get to. That was really good. It's a shame we didn't make it. These guidebooks, the guidebook series are all about 10,000 words. You can link to any of those. I've touched on some of the ideas from the socially dynamic organization today and the quiet leadership work. Those are all free as the ebooks if you're interested in that. But thanks, Richard, for inviting me along, and thank you everybody for kicking those ideas around. It's been wonderful meeting you all.
Julian, thank you ever so much,
Thank
and thank you
you.
for those slides, which we'll send out with some links to Julian's work, which yeah, I get an awful lot out of it, and I hope you will too. We're going for a summer break. Apart from Headspace members, we'll see you on Wednesday for a light bulb moment. Otherwise, we'll see you after the summer break, and I hope you managed to get some time, some well-earned time off work as well, and we'll see you more likely in September. Julian, thank you so much again. Please do leave us some feedback in the chat.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Really good,
Bye-bye.
even though I kept getting interrupted. Thank you.
Good luck, boss.
Thank you.
Julian, stay on. I want to say thank you properly. Nice to see you, Martin. Thanks for coming. Wow, that was fab.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think, you know, summer kicks in earlier and earlier. I thought we'd get a few more. It enables us to do, or you to do, some good conversations in the round, but I feel slightly apologetic that it wasn't the 25-30 that I thought we would.
Nice size group. It's great.
Do have a look at the chat. There's some nice points in there. Paul is saying fantastic. It's really thought provoking. So yeah, that was oh, that's great. That's I don't know how you managed to fit so much in really in such a short space of time in terms of the size of concepts. It's really such a gift really. And thank you so much for doing the slides. It's absolutely brilliant. Thanks, Jim.
I'll send you the slides over and a few links, and you know, we'll stay in touch for our other session. I know. So.
Yeah, that's right. I think we've got a call in, haven't we? So that's good. Yeah, that'd be great. Julian, thank you so much. Absolute pleasure. Yeah, I'm happy to keep my fanboy credentials up there.
Going. Thanks.
Hope you have a lovely holiday.
Thank you. I'll see you later. Take care. Bye.
Cheers, Julian. Bye.